Hello, dear listeners, and welcome back to the Frankly Speaking podcast by Friends of Europe. I am your host this week, Chris Kremidas-Courtney, Senior Fellow for Peace, Security, and Defense, and Our Digital Future. In recent episodes, we've discussed the various ways that emerging technologies such as extended reality, artificial intelligence, and neurotechnology are impacting democracy, security, and human agency. This week, we'll be talking about digital democracy, so we are delighted to be joined by Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Minister for Digital Affairs. Audrey Tang is a globally recognized hacktivist and software engineer who protested Taiwan's government during the 2014 Sunflower Movement and later became their country's first digital minister and first non-binary and openly transgender cabinet member in the world. Minister Audrey Tang is leading the way on developing Taiwan's digital democracy, considered one of the most open in the world. Minister Tang, welcome to the podcast. And let's start with our first question. We've seen in recent years how Taiwan has become a global leader on digital democracy. Can you please explain to our listeners Taiwan's approach to digital democracy?
Certainly. So it begins Taiwan's democratization in the 80s, and in 96 we had our first direct election of our president. And by that time, the World Web is already widely popular in Taiwan. So in a sense, the digital world and the democracy went hand to hand in tandem in the Taiwanese history. Now, we talk about the bandwidth and the latency of technology a lot, but I also like to extend this metaphor to democracy. Traditional democracy using centuries-old methodologies is a very high latency, like once every 4 years or 2 years, and very low bandwidth, like 3 bits or 5 bits every time you vote technology. But just like any social technology, it improves as people introduce better bandwidth and lower latency. For example, in Taiwan, 5,000 people joining in an e-signature can summon a ministerial response, or if it's cross-ministerial, the participation officers run a collaborative meeting, usually in a place that the people petitions. So that is how we get the 17 years old and 70 years old working hand in hand to push for example, banning plastic straws or things like that in all sorts of pro-social ways. And that increases the bandwidth because you can do a continuous integration of the citizens' input. Or we have presidential hackathon that invites people to take their ideas that works on a small district, for example, remote telemedicine and things like that, and work across all the sectors. And 5 winners each year, we give them the fiscal, the personnel, and the regulatory support to take their local ideas into the next year's presidential mandate to make it truly national. Again, this rewards cross-sector collaboration by reducing the latency from having an idea to implementing the idea.
Thank you so much. I think that's something, having read a lot about what you're doing there in Taiwan, that's an aspect I never thought of, is that the more frequent inputs from people instead of sort of the periodic ones. So, I mean, it's already really, thinking in a very different way about digital democracy. So thank you for that. And also, since Taiwan is a global leader on digital democracy, we're all sort of watching what you're doing. What has Taiwan learned from digital citizen engagement platforms like vTaiwan and Join, and you probably have an even newer one now. So, and what have you learned from those, and how do you build buy-in from people who may not be so comfortable using digital platforms?
Yeah, vTaiwan started late 2014, and around that time, almost a decade ago, the idea of retweets, of things going viral, and so on is all the rage. There were some jurisdictions that simply refused to tolerate any civil society organizing online, and therefore imposed very draconian control to censor the speech internally. And in Taiwan, while we recognize the retweet button, the share button, does increase polarization and extremism, we embraced without censorship or takedown by building similar social media platforms, but in the social sector. So with the help of credibly neutral places, such as our National Academy or the PTT Forum, which is like Reddit, except it's run by students of the National Taiwan University for 25 years. It's all open source, community governed. It doesn't serve shareholders or advertisers. In such pro-social social media, we collaborated with the social sector to share the agenda setting power. So in the V-Taiwan formula, the online part of agenda setting, we ask people, for example, what do you think about the Uber X driver with no professional driver's license, picking up strangers they meet on the street through an app and charging them for it? We ask such open-ended questions that would probably always lead to polarization if asked on the antisocial corners of social media, but because we design it to be pro-social, the common values that bridges across the divides surface to the top. We use early AI algorithms not to build addiction, but to build consensus. So, for example, while one side thinks it's gig economy that exploits the workers, and the other side thinks it's a platform economy that is the future of economy, both sides think that insurance, registration, and so on is important, and so is not undercutting existing meters. So by designing the pro-social social media engagement platforms, within 3 weeks, we immediately get a good picture to people's eyes. Where are we polarized and where do we actually agree? And then we invite the stakeholders to the table, to a multi-stakeholder meeting, and the agenda is set just by the consensus points that's established by the online part of conversation. So this is a hybrid model, the online agenda setting and the offline face-to-face meeting that suits out the feasibility of implementing those common values. And because it's always live streamed, so people who speak, for example, committing to the agenda that's set by the crowd, like from Uber and the taxi union and so on, directly transform to workable regulations and even laws. The V-Taiwan process counts 80% or so success rates in the 2 dozens or so of the deliberations that we run during 2014 to 2017. And after that, it's becoming a national level regulation of participation officers, and the joint platform is in turn maintained by the National Development Council to tackle not just emerging economy issues, but with all issues. And to date, the joint platform has served more than half of Taiwanese population.
More than half the population. I think that makes a lot of democracies green with envy to have that level of citizen engagement. And can you briefly, just to quickly follow up, you talked about pro-social media. Are there any other examples of pro-social media we can learn about? Because I think it's so unique and it's so needed in today's world.
Yes. So the algorithm, that's to say the code that we did for V-Taiwan, is with the help of an algorithm called POLIS or POL.is. And POLIS is designed, as I mentioned, to visualize not just the polarization, but also the degree of agreement of bridging narratives of bipartisanship. Now, the best thing about POLIS is that it's all open source. Everybody can set it about itself and also build research on top of it. And one team called Birdwatch, later Community Notes in Twitter, took the idea from POLIS and built the fact-checking community on top of Twitter. So now if you see a tweet by, I don't know, Elon Musk or someone that sometimes collapses the context, you will see a very helpful note, a community note attached to the tweet. So it travels when people retweet it. And the algorithm to select what community note to display is exactly the same as the POLIS, in that we select the voices that cuts across the divide and bridges across ideological differences.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I was reading this week the new Bad Bot survey from Imperva and saw that now 47% of all internet traffic comes from bots. Probably not news to you. And it seems that humans may soon be outnumbered on the internet. So, here at Friends of Europe, we talk a lot about these things. And, given these numbers, 47%, probably growing, plus the emergence of new technologies like extended reality, artificial intelligence, How do you see Taiwan's approach to digital democracy evolving in the future?
That's a great question. Indeed, in Taiwan, we have broadband as a human right. So anywhere, if you don't have the kind of bandwidth to do the kind of the video conferencing we're doing now, it's personally my fault, and I will see to it that it's addressed. And because without broadband access, if you only have intermittent text-based access, there really is no way to tell a human from a bot. The way of our continuous interaction and like I see you nodding to my this sentence and not like 5 sentences ago, and so on, is essential in establishing a sense of rapport, of mutual support across the internet. So this is a very basic layer. And on top of that, for asynchronous communications like electronic documents and so on, we also have a pretty advanced system that lets you digitally sign documents on your phone using the FIDO for authentication and PKCS for internationally recognized signatures and so on. So it can be signed using a form of a plastic card, or it can also be with your phone and carry it wherever you go. And so this is exactly the same as how we're in the cybersecurity. We have this idea of zero trust architecture, in that whenever I sign a document, it checks my biometric on my device, not anywhere else, and the fingerprint of that device so that it's not compromised, and also the behavior. Like if I suddenly connect from Taipei, and then the next minute I change my IP address and connect from Belgium, then that's probably something fishy is going on, maybe involving a VPN. So basically, by designing with the triple factor in mind, we make sure that when people sign official documents or otherwise those things, they will be associated with an actual verifiable credential and identity, so that one can distinguish a human versus a bot. But of course, that also carries privacy implications. So we're working with the Wireless Consortium, W3C, on what we call zero knowledge proofs of identity. That is to say, for example, if I want to buy some alcohol or whatever, I have to prove that I'm of 18 years old, but I don't need to reveal my age. And the verifiable credentials, decentralized identifiers, and so on are the kind of technology we're rolling out as we speak.
Thank you so much. And a few things there. One is the architecture and the approach you described sounds like a good way to do online voting in a safe and trusted way. But I had one one question about what you mentioned about broadband as a human right. I know it's a dream in some places. You're actually trying to do it. What are I mean, whenever people talk about broadband as a human right, it's always the cost issue comes up. Well, we can't afford it, right? So I guess if you could let us know, since you're actually doing it, you've done it, and you're always working on it, what are the major challenges to enacting a policy of broadband as a human right, and how do you overcome them?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So, like many other jurisdictions, we have a universal service fund that asks the telecoms to heavily subsidize the kind of telecom construction that they hear of the places that does not make full commercial sense to build broadband. But we also invest a lot in advanced research and development to get more inexpensive ways of delivering broadband. Microwave transmitters from the early era, and from now, non-geostationary satellite access, and even balloons that are either tethered or untethered. All these are ways to deliver to the last mile. And we have a long table of the least served areas, usually due to lack of electricity and so on. But even on those, for example, high mountains, the tip of Taiwan, almost 4,000 meters high, we still use, for example, helicopters to have the 5G or 4G telecom towers, or including solar panels and so on, so that it can be placed in a way that even remote and far off from the power grid, it can still power itself and serve the communication needs. So I would say It's both sensible spectrum allocation and spectrum auction rules, and the Universal Service Fund with an eye on innovation.
Thank you. Wow, so much to learn there. And just one last question for you today, and that is, what can Europe and the broader West learn from Taiwan's approach to digital democracy? We've watched, we all struggle with disinformation. We all struggle with disinformation during COVID, and somehow this transparency, this openness, this approach to Taiwan has. Well, it probably seemed difficult where you are. We all watched and said, "Wow, they're doing it right." So, what can we, what can we learn from your approach? What lessons can we take?
So, to give no trust is to get no trust. So, even when the people's trust in the government was at a historic low, at below 10% in 2014 in Taiwan, we worked tirelessly with Korea Public Service. We built alliance with them to make sure that still we trust the citizens, even though the citizen at that time doesn't trust back. And that means radical transparency. Every lobbyist visit, every interview, including this one with me, you can find it online under Creative Commons. So people understand the why and how of policy making, not just the what of policies. Because open data, if it's done in a continuous way, like open API, when things happen, people can see that there is an immutable record that is already there. But if you only open because of demand of freedom of information access or things like that, people suspect the Korean Public Service of red acting or selective opening up and so on. So building a culture of continuous integration of citizen input is of course important, but it rests on the foundation of radical transparency and open data. And especially in the context of the pandemic, when people understand the latest versions, right, of the virus code, of the mutation of the virus, people do have their adaptability and resilience that they can counter the latest variants of the virus. If we do it in a way of top-down lockdowns, take-down shutdowns, without explaining fully the science behind it, then when the virus mutates, but the measures do not, it leads to a lot of distrust between all the stakeholders. But by opening up and basically working with the journalists to answer all questions every 2 p.m., it enables everyone to gain a degree of understanding of epidemiology. And also, we work with students and lifelong learning centers so they can actually fact check by contributing to the grassroots fact checking network. Epidemiology, public health expertise to the coronavirus is like journalism, civic journalism to the disinformation crisis. When everybody learns the basic habits of wearing a mask and washing hands and so on, then people build vaccines of the mind, immunity of the mind against polarization and extremism.
Thank you so much. And I think that's something we're all aiming for is that cognitive immunization, sort of that cognitive resilience that takes so much more than education, but a whole systemic approach. And that's all the time we have for this week's episode, dear listeners. And once again, we'd like to thank our guest, Minister Audrey Tang, for joining us. You can learn more about digital democracy in Taiwan by going to moda.gov.tw. That's all for us this week, and goodbye.
We'll leave it there for today. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the Frankly Speaking podcast newsletter, or following us on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or Facebook. And if you've enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or a rating, as it truly helps us reach more curious minds like yours. And don't forget to tune in again this time next week.